So we're going to hear now from the 2024 Rendezvous cohort. So their lessons were first conceived and workshopped on the Klamath River trip. And then back at their home institutions, they demoed the lessons on test students. You can order them from Amazon. And they wrote up the lessons with several rounds of feedback and mentoring from the leadership team and previous scholars. So what you'll see today are brief trailers of these lessons that, not a lot of depth, but you'll get a sense of what's out there and be intrigued to learn more by going to the QUBES website. So let me present the 2024 River Scholars and their lessons.
Our first presentation is actually a recording. Cheyenne Olson wasn't able to join us, but she did take time to record a presentation, so we'll start off with hers.
Hi, my name is Cheyenne Olson, and I teach at Northeastern State University. I'm sorry that I couldn't be present today, but I'm actually in class teaching right now, so I'm just going to run through my project, which was measuring crayfish habitat selection and use. I had 4 different learning objectives, and that included number 1, formulating and testing hypotheses about the relationships that we see between habitat features of the stream and crayfish population metrics, such as the number or diversity of crayfish and size of crayfish. We also wanted to collect and analyze data on water quality, substrate, vegetation, and crayfish populations to look at them all together. Apply the scientific method for crayfish species identification, measurement, and population assessment. And then reflect on the influence that any kind of change in habitat characteristics would have on either crayfish distribution, population metrics, or size, and draw some evidence-based conclusions based on what we saw in the field. So for the methods of this, I started with a short introductory lecture on crayfish biology and ecology. And I recommended that for anybody doing this, they also do a short lecture. And in that lecture, try to identify some local crayfish. So for instance, in Oklahoma, we have a scientific paper that came out semi-recently that has all the latest species, and so that's what I use. After that introduction, I actually had the students pick the site that they wanted to look at, and I put in my study that you could potentially do 1 or more sites and compare them. But after they picked the site, they made some observations about the site. We actually went there, they made notes about the habitat, and they began to formulate their hypotheses for what they expected with the crayfish population. We then collected water quality and habitat data. And in this part of my study, I realized it could probably be broken up into 2 different days, where one day is the water quality and habitat day, and the second day is the actual crayfish monitoring measurement day. But we collected data about substrate, vegetation, canopy cover, stuff like that. We then actually collected crayfish, and during our collection, we collected so many we had to stop. There were just too many here. But with our crayfish, we sexed them. We figured out their size of both like chela and total body carapace, and what substrate and or vegetation they were found in. At the very end, I had students in groups, and they came back together to compare what they found based on different habitat or different location, and any water quality metrics that they thought possibly influenced the crayfish. So at the very end of the class, we had a discussion where we just talked about what our original hypotheses were and whether or not what we found in the field supported that. So for me, this was a field day. I managed to do this in about 2 hours with a follow-up lab where we did some data analysis. We just used a local stream that's easily accessible from campus, and I took 14 limnology students with me. Reflecting on this, I actually recommend in my study that you tie this in with other QUBES lessons. And so there's a couple on there that do a great job of introducing both like habitat and field sketch. So I recommended those. And I think that this would definitely work better in the future as a 2-day trip where you break up the habitat and the crayfish portion, or you do the field sampling and then the data analysis separate. It just would make it easier for time management. But this also pairs really well with other labs, especially labs you could follow up with. And one that I would recommend is a macroinvertebrate lab. While we were out there collecting crayfish, we collected a lot of macros at the same time. All in all, student feedback said that this was really fun. I had a really good time. So I would definitely do it again. And I appreciate the opportunity. So thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, so next up, we'll hear from Erin Tracy, investigating impacts of river impairment through fish sampling.
Hi, I'm Erin. I'm a PhD student at UC Davis. And yeah, as Andy said, I took my students out to do some field sampling with seine nets.
Next slide.
Yes, sorry. Do I just tell
let
you?
Me know. Okay. Let me know when they want to advance here.
Cool. Yeah, so the learning objectives for this, I did this with an intro ichthyology class of about 50 students. Most of them hadn't done a lot of work in a river, so a lot of it was just getting them outside in a river, learning aquatic ecology sampling skills, like how to effectively pull a seine net and be able to sample fish, how to ID fish species, and really focused on how to handle fish in the field when weighing and measuring them. The students also kind of focused on, in a more broad sense, how to collect data and answer research questions with that data. And then specifically, my study was focused on looking at the impacts of human actions. So we were looking at an impaired stream and a non-impaired stream with a dam and a stream that had restored flows. Yeah, next slide. Oh, back.
Oh, did I go too fast? Sorry. There we go.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, methods. Yeah, so as I mentioned, we did seine netting. I think this was really great for an intro class because usually you seine in a slow part of the river where it's pretty shallow and it was easy to access. So we didn't have a lot of worries with safety. And we had them all cycle through and take turns learning how to pull the seine, which takes at least 2 people, but ideally 3. And then I had myself and another TA leading it. And so they collected the fish, they weighed them, they measured them, and they recorded the species. And then we also had the people on the bank often taking the site data. So we did habitat type, study conditions, and we commented on if it was an impaired or a non-impaired site. That was what happened during my field day with them. We then had a follow-up lab where they were analyzing the data. So I have in my lesson like ways that they can take this a step further if they're wanting to look at like statistical significant differences between fish communities by doing stuff like chi-squared test and relative weight, but it can kind of scale up or down depending on how much time and what you want to do with the class. Okay, next slide. So yeah, reflections. I also think this should be at least 2 days. We had 1 day in the field, but yeah, it would be a lot easier if you had more time to be able to spread this into 2 days, especially visiting 2 sites like the impaired and the non-impaired. I did this with an intro, like a pretty large class, and we had only planned to go to 1 site, and that site definitely got oversampled by the time all 50 of them had cycled through using the seine net. So in the future, depending on how many groups you have, like if it was a group of 15, like I have in my upper undergrad classes, it would be easier to pick 1 site, but larger groups, you might need to be moving down the river as you go. I also think this would pair great with some of the other cubed lessons. I know Anna did a great one on impairment, looking at macroinvertebrates and the different groups, and also looking at how human communities impact the river and doing those kinds of cube lessons. So yeah, that was it. It was great to be outside with the students.
Thank you very much.
All right, next we'll hear from John Kayantash. Hydrology scavenger hunt, a streamside lesson to identify hydrological features in general, whitewater and waterfall settings.
Oh, thank you, Andy. Yeah, so I am a earth science faculty member at California State University Dominguez Hills, and I came up with this lesson as something that I can use with students spanning the range of non-major introductory students all the way up to upper division major students, and probably could even go as far as graduate students, although I don't have any. Okay, but it's adaptable. So next slide. All right, so I had several learning outcomes. The general idea was that I want students to be able to identify features in the field, and by seeing these features with their eyes, they're also able to get an understanding of what those features represent. So there's a range of topics to look at, hydrological features, which I've categorized, and I'll explain that in a minute. But the students effectively, they'll go out into the field with knowledge of they have a glossary of features at their disposal, and they're taken to a stretch of a stream, and they're asked to wander the stream and identify features and justify why they see what they see. They're supposed to document it and justify why they believe that's correct. And of course, the instructor's nearby, but they're also relying on their glossary to do so. So that really ties into the third one. I want them to attain student skill in making observations in the natural world. And then a fourth element, which is part of a post-trip experience, is I wanted them to develop some sort of awareness of mental health benefits of time spent in the outdoors. You know, a couple of people previously have said, oh, we had a great time, had a good time out in the field. So that's what we know as outdoor practitioners, that generally we have good times and our students have a good time. And I wanted to make that a conscious element of it also. All right, next slide. All right, so this scavenger hunt, as I'm calling it, is basically going out to see what features they can find. The hunt is not intended to be a race necessarily, although some people maybe could, some feedback from some of the peers was that maybe it could be competitive if you really had some advanced students, so that would be motivational. But with my audience, it was intended more just to go out and see what features you could find and how well you can document them. And they would record those. In the center there, you see a graphic of some log sheets. So those have the feature names on them, and it's basically a checklist. And the students would write where they were geographically, where they saw it, maybe some details about the environment that might be a mental note for them. And they would ultimately use that as a organizer to then document it in their logbook. And that could be in color, it could be with photographs, etc., sketches. And then on the left is the first page of the multi-page glossary, which they were provided with sort of as a guidance for these features. Okay, next slide. So aside from the time spent in the field, there was a pre-trip assignment to get them oriented with the location where they would be. And that involves some map work, finding where they would be, maybe tracing out the distance that they thought they would walk down the river, maybe doing something like computing the gradient for the stream stretch that they're going to visit. There's also a post-trip reflection exercise that I mentioned.
4 minutes.
And then this lesson, I think, was well suited for students of varying expertise. There's also, as it shows here, a fluid dynamics component, which was part of the general features. So I didn't quite mention it, but there are three sheets. A general sheet, which has features you find on most streams, a whitewater sheet in case students are visiting a whitewater stretch of river, and perhaps some waterfall features if they're on that sort of a stream. So fluid dynamics would be an extension of the general if the instructor chose to do that. Okay, next slide. So the experience went well. I did it in October with a set of students, and my idea is to go in the future, perhaps from a boat-based experience, to see what kind of features students can identify from a floating platform. And I'm also excited to try this with my earth science majors and see how they do with a more advanced approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John.
Okay, now we'll hear from Erasme, exploring the influence of hydrogeomorphology on Odonata communities in a river corridor.
Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. So this lesson is meant to provide an introduction to this magnificent world of Odonates, but also most importantly, it's meant to equip students with better observation skills for most important features of the river. And we use, I chose to, among multiple other ways you can really equip students to develop those skills, I use Odonates because they are sensitive to land use changes and hydrogeomorphological feature, and also them being very attractive, appealing, so it's a good way to engage students into the field. Next. Objectives are mainly, by the end of the lesson, I realized that students were able to identify, at least at higher taxonomic level, family level, be able to distinguish different groups at family level, and also get to see those hydrogeomorphological features, get to distinguish them, and get to see understand how those features are attracting or attract different groups of Odonates. So that kind of association. Those 3 points are really the learning objective of this course. This lesson also provides an opportunity for engaging students from reflecting on what they're expecting to observe, and also having that hands-on, first-hand experience with collecting and manipulating data. Another benefit when it comes to engagement is similar as John's, which is really increasing improving the being in the moment while being in the field, contemplating while on the site. And the steps for data collection are set in a way that actually there's enough time for while waiting from moving one side to another, or between observations, there's enough time to kind of contemplate and be in the present. So when it comes to site selection, it's completely fine to pick a site that has at least one contrasting subsite with really contrasting feature. Let's say fast flowing water versus almost stagnant water, having a site that has those 2, or a density a site that has dense macrophytes versus a site that doesn't have those macrophytes. Those type of really contrasting feature is very important for get benefits and to get to the learning experience of this course. And also towards the end, connected to the engagement, the reflection on the initial hypothesis, and see how actually after observations, see how initial hypotheses have changed after observations. Next. I realized that this lesson would land well with students who's really, it's not the first time to hear geomorphology feature. So a lesson before this that introduces this is really would be good. And also having an idea on simple life cycle of ordinates as an introduction class is very helpful. A last point is that this lesson would pair very well with multiple other lessons, lab-based lessons that or courses that we offer, like stream ecology courses, restoration, especially when it comes to reflecting how changes in the hydrogeomorphology can affect those populations. It's very powerful. And also another emerging element of opportunity for teaching these courses within ecotoxicology, especially when it comes to understanding how ordinates can be used are currently being used as biosentinels for Medicaid, for example. For knowing that some taxa would be good, serving better that role to serve as biosentinels for certain contaminants, it's a good introductory point for students to enter in that area of ecotoxicology as well. Yes, I think that's it for now.
Thank you very much.
All right. Okay, Karen Mager will talk about how we can attract and restore beavers, a field investigation of vegetation, preferences, and habitat suitability.
Hello, everyone. Good to see you today. So I am a professor at Southern Oregon University, and I teach our field methods classes, upper level ecology, upper level mammalogy, upper level restoration, and all of those things kind of overlap with the topic of beavers and how they can really shape our ecosystems. So I wanted to build a lesson that would be accessible to upper level students from a variety of classes to get to explore that. So next slide. Okay, so I listed my learning outcomes, but first I started with my big dream goal here, which is really just about students starting from observing beaver activity at a site and then figuring out how to connect those observations to the value of that site for restoring beaver and their ecological engineering benefits on the landscape. So the specific learning outcomes that go with that, I had 4 of them. I wanted students to be able to explain how beavers alter their habitats as ecosystem engineers and why this matters for ecosystem function. I wanted them to practice and really learn how to identify signs of beaver activity, as well as some of the species of riparian woody vegetation that beaver rely on. Then have students design and carry out a field survey to test a hypothesis about beaver vegetation preferences. And finally, evaluate a field site suitability for beavers by relating field observations to information about the habitat, the vegetation, and things like that. And so these learning goals correspond to all these different steps of the activity that I'll basically talk about on the next slide. We can go there next. All right. So this lesson is really designed to be conducted over a minimum of a 2-hour lab period. And ideally, this starts with very curiosity-based exploration for students. So going to a site and having the instructor start maybe by pointing out signs of beaver activity, how to identify beaver nod twigs and differentiate them from twigs that might have been browsed by deer or things like that. And then give students the chance to really explore and observe those signs on their own. The goal here is that students will notice patterns like which trees do beavers seem to be cutting? Where are they? How far are those from other signs we can see in the landscape, like beaver slides into the water, dams, lodges, those parts of the habitat that are going to be central to beaver activity in the site. And at this exploration point, instructors are also ideally helping students connect what they observe to previous readings. So in my lesson, I suggest a couple readings that can really help students understand how beavers help to restore landscapes, as well as what some of their vegetation preferences are. Then, once students have had the chance to make those explorations, instructors help guide them through developing hypotheses about what trees beavers might choose to cut, what might they prefer. This can be factors like the distance from the water, the species of the tree, the size, and those might all interact with one another too. The goal here is that students develop a hypothesis and make some predictions and then actually go out and complete a simple survey to test those hypotheses. So this gives students practice with identifying some common tree species, measuring tree diameter at breast height.
4 minutes.
and distance to shore. And then finish is with a little time actually in the field to look at their findings and see what they found and share them out with the group. Okay, next slide. I'll be quick with this, but this lab does fit in a 3-hour lab period, about 2 hours in the field, if students are at an upper level and already have some of this background information. If they don't, this can be adapted to give students a little less choice and autonomy in what they design, or expanded to a larger class period. I'm going to be trying it out in a 6-hour class in the spring. This lesson is also flexible in different restoration contexts. You can use it to examine a site that doesn't have beavers right now, but might have them in the future. And I tested this out in dumping, pouring rain, and the students still had a lot of fun. And so I think the big thing is that students here, even in Oregon and the beaver state, haven't necessarily seen beavers or even noticed their impact on the landscape. And this is a lab that will really lead them into that process of seeing the role of beavers in the landscape around them. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much.
All right. Jen Kim and Sarah Kelly will share their work, Mapping Rivers for Planning and Policy, a Deliberative Approach.
Hi, my name is Jan Kim Bui. I'm a PhD student here at Portland State University, and Sarah Kelly and I wrote this lesson together. Sarah is a research professor and lecturer at Dartmouth, and we wrote this lesson on collaborative mapping so that we could, and we ended up being able to test this lesson with 2 distinct groups of students. I was able to pilot this lesson with undergraduate and graduate students in a 3-hour workshop social setting at 2 different sites in an urban watershed here in Portland, Oregon. And
I can explain.
I'll turn this over to Sarah now to explain yours.
And I was able to test this out pilot it with my undergraduate students at Dartmouth College, and we moved between 2 sites on the Black River in Vermont. So we're both cultural geographers, so we're here from the social science side, and there's, for those who are new to this, there's both physical scientists and social scientists who are part of this network, among other disciplines. And so our overall lesson goal was to introduce students to river management and how different human and more than human relationships shape river flows. I focus more on disasters and flooding, and Thea and Kim will talk about their approach to this lesson plan. So the specific goals were to grasp how these different relationships shape a river, and then to learn about river and resource management plans. So we both did additional lessons tied into this field trip throughout the course. And so we built from that initial lesson plan. And so the transversal lesson learning objectives were to, 1, connect scientific information with desired societal outcomes and help teach students about how policymaking works. 2, to improve collaboration and deliberation skills with peers. So we used the participatory mapping of the rivers as a way to facilitate dialogue and share different understanding among the students, and then think about how that mapping or visual and spatial understanding can translate to policy goals. And then 3, to communicate scientific information with peers and instructors. So I think we both love maps, and they're a great way to help facilitate communication, particularly about different aspects of the river. So my lesson focused more on, I taught it with community partners. So we learned about dragonfly habitat and different macroinvertebrates and different aspects of floodplain restoration. And then Thea and Kim's topic was connected but different. So I'll pass it over to Thea and Kim to add a bit more information there.
Yeah, I was not able to pilot as part of a class, but one of my research fields is in collaborative governance, and especially around water conflict. And so what I used this lesson for was bringing in a bunch of students who had various degrees of experience with watersheds, what they knew, what they didn't know. And I used it as a diagnostic activity with them to find out what sort of knowledge do people come into these places with. And at the end of this lesson, how has that knowledge changed over the 3 hours we had together? So next slide, please. So what we did was we paired role-playing with a collaborative mapping exercise. And so to that end, I asked all of my workshop participants to imagine themselves in different roles, like if they were playing a human role,
4 minutes,
taking the role of a government agency person, or an animal for more than human roles, animal, tree, plant, whatever. And so we used field mapping, no GIS required. And as students recorded this information on transparencies, we had them overlay their collected data in the field so they could start to see those shared sites of interest or conflict emerge immediately. and begin having conversations right there. Next slide, please.
Do we get an extra minute, James, since there's two of us?
No, sorry.
Okay, go ahead, thank him.
Okay, so I felt my biggest takeaway was that paper management on the move continues to be a challenge. We were moving around a lot, and there were a lot of different pieces of paper flying, and I found myself returning papers to people constantly. Sarah?
Yeah. Let's see, sorry, I got pushed off by the timing. So yeah, we talked about, oh yeah, I did it at the beginning of the term, and it ended up being an amazing way to start off the term with the students, and it like set a really strong connection with the river for this whole social impact course where they're doing community-based projects. And so I just wished that if I do this again, that I bring them back to the river at the end of the course to really like have those bookends and close the course out in that way. And I hadn't planned it and intended it to be. It was a much more powerful exercise than I intended. So that's how I would do it next time.
Thanks very much, guys.
Okay, next we have Anna Meza Salazar, exploring the impact of urbanization on macroinvertebrate assemblages and functional feeding groups in stream ecosystems.
Hi, I'm Anna. I just finished my PhD at North Carolina State University, and I am starting a new postdoctoral position at the University of Arkansas. So this lesson focuses on understanding the impact of urbanization on stream ecosystems by studying macroinvertebrate assemblages and their functional feeding groups. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the goals are to connect ecological changes caused by urbanization with real-world conservation and maybe with urban planning. And students will learn to analyze these impacts, apply field and lab techniques, and communicate findings effectively. So by the end, they will develop skills in data collection and analysis and hypothesis testing, and preparing them for future applications in environmental science. Next, please. So the approach combines field work, lab analysis, and data interpretation, emphasizing the functional roles of macroinvertebrates and how urbanization alters these roles. So students start by formulating research questions, visit two contrasting sites, urbanized and reference or less urbanized sites, and then they collect macroinvertebrates and measure variables of physical-chemical variables like pH or conductivity, and some environmental variables like riparian vegetation. And in the lab, they identify organisms, assign the functional feeding groups, and they analyze the data. So finally, they synthesize these findings in posters or presentations and connected their work to broader ecological and conservation questions. And this hands-on approach helps the students relate what they learn to real-world challenges. Next, please. So these lessons goes beyond traditional bioassessment by focusing on ecosystem function, but could use as a complement to the bioassessment lesson published in 2024, and also with other QUBES that were published this year. So it allows students to experience the full scientific process, from forming hypotheses to presenting results. So as a next step, I plan to translate this to Spanish. I have made some progress on that, but I hope have it soon. And that's all. Thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity and for all your feedback and for having me.
Thank you, Anna.
Next, we'll hear from Dana Quick, exploring soil formation and variation along stream channels.
Hi. So if you don't know me, my name is Dana Quick, and I teach geography at the College of Marin, which is in California. And I got my undergrad and graduate degrees in geography, physical geography, but my graduate research was looking at the impact of salt-rich dust on soils in the Owens Valley. So I wanted to create a lesson on soils and streams. And of course, the work of streams is incredibly important in the formation of soils. So in creating this lesson, I was thinking about using it in an introduction to physical geography class or earth science or environmental science class. And the title is Exploring Soil Formation and Variation Along Stream Channels. Next. So the lesson goals are to get students to connect stream processes to the formation of soils. And part of that is introducing the soil formation concepts and how soils can vary along stream channels. And then also to emphasize how the streams influence these soil forming factors, specifically climate, organisms, relief, parent material, and time. And of course, the work of streams can impact all of these factors. Next. So the objectives that the students are given for this lesson are to be able to describe the soil forming factors and how they might be influenced by streams, and then also to learn how to determine some of the physical soil characteristics. And I was thinking about something that could be done in a short period of time, and that isn't too challenging. And so I came up with the soil color, which can tell us information about parent material and organic matter and the age of the soil. And then also what the soil texture is using a simple hand analysis in the field. And then students are taking soil samples from different locations along the stream. I got carried away and started going to the information on the next slide. But and then the third objective is explaining the relationship between soil properties and their spatial location relative to stream channels. Next. Okay, so obviously this was on-site field work, and we did it within 3 hours. Some of this the samples could be brought back to the lab or the classroom setting depending on any time constraints, but we were able to actually do the analysis in the field. Obviously, I think some introduction to the soil forming factors ahead of time would allow for there to be more time to really utilize your time in the field. But we did have a brief explanation in the beginning of the soil factors. And then we explored the area along the stream channel, looking for different features, some that might be erosional, some depositional, that the stream would have impacted along the reach of stream where we were. And then I asked groups of students to choose 2 sites that would differ from one another and that may have, therefore, variation in soil forming factors. So those student groups determined 2 different locations, and they used the Munsell color chart to determine soil color, and then the texture through the hand analysis. Then they compared the soil properties that they found between their 2 locations and analyzed how they varied depending on where they were in terms of the stream and other fluvial geomorphic features. We relate observed variations to those factors influenced by the stream. Next. Okay, quick reflection is it was difficult in scouting out an area of or reach of the stream corridor that was accessible and that had a variation in fluvial geomorphic features, private property, dense vegetation, steep slopes. Some of those were the obstacles. And I piloted the lesson with 6 eager volunteer students who I'd had from previous classes. So my next step is to pilot the lesson with the classes that I'm teaching this semester, and that would give me an opportunity to test this out on a larger class size with some of the students perhaps maybe not being as eager to be out there as the students that I had originally piloted the lesson with.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, Jamie March, incorporating public engagement into river-based courses.
Great, thanks. I work at a small liberal arts college called Washington and Jefferson College, and I tried to riff on the theme of the River Field Studies Network here, right? Rivers are vital, complex, and in crisis. Field studies, same. And I would argue public engagement with science is also vital, complex, in crisis, and often ignored and not incorporated into courses. Next slide. These are 3 smaller learning objectives, but to follow on Karen's big dream goal, main idea was I was just trying to champion all of us to consider incorporating public engagement activities into our courses. I think you can do it in any course. You'll see in a minute, there's 3 parts. The first couple parts involve reading some literature, and then students reflect on their own personal journey and how they connected with science. And then dissect the papers, and then hopefully come up with their own hypothetical engagement activity, and then finally do one. So you can see these 3 describe the mutual importance of public engagement to society. The key thing to emphasize there is mutual, that the scientists are learning just as much from the community, making sure when possible and appropriate that is a 2-way flow of information, And then hopefully if the students do actually do a community or public engagement project, they find this connection with the people and the local rivers and science through that. Next slide. So just a quick shout out to these two papers. I think the titles tell the story, and shout out to Susan Washko, one of our members. But essentially they talk about how it's not hard to add this to your science and to try and not be afraid of it. So part of the lesson, there's a bunch of worksheets and reflections that you can go through. And then next slide. Then this is just one example of a community engagement project I was able to pilot over the summer. I taught a aquatic ecology course for non-science majors. There was actually only 3 students, so it was pretty easy. And we luckily have a community center adjacent to college that is awesome, that we've worked with a lot. And so the main idea here was college students learn stream ecology, work with the campers on the river, learning about stream ecology, and then the campers and the college students together present it at a STEM fest in the downtown. So that's the main idea, but really with part 3 and in the lesson, there's some worksheets faculty can go through to try and come up with their own public engagement activity. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Jamie.
Okay, Suzanne Walther, River Connectivity Across Space and Time.
Susanna Walter here from the University of San Diego. I will be talking, I piloted my project on the San Diego River right in San Diego. It's in our backyard and right near campus. But one of my primary goals, I have a picture here of part of the watershed and sites we go to. And then my focus was really connectivity in rivers is a thing longitudinally and latitude you know, sort of laterally. But I wanted to incorporate this sense of time. So I have a picture here of Mission Valley along the river today, and also a picture of the Kumeyaay people that interacted with this river in this space and still do today, in fact. Next slide. So the goals are really to connect students to the river, both spatially and over this historic time, and to practice observational skill and learn some new methods in the field. And ultimately then interpret that data and then communicate it in the context of that bigger history. So those were sort of my big picture goals. And we did that in a variety of ways. One was through observations at each of these sites, and identifying specific measures that we took on the river also at specific sites. Oh, and then working together to do that in small groups, and then ultimately communicating that as well. Next slide, please. Sorry, I made a few edits on these earlier or just recently, and they're a little different stuff. So ultimately, they're introduced to the bigger picture of watershed function and the broader history of whatever river this is. They take measures at specific sites, and they to try and understand how these all connect within the watershed. And so what this ended up involving is pre-field trip courses that introduce the watershed connectivity, the river, and how to do the samples, and to the samples like methods, instruments, and analysis. And then on-site fieldwork, so a field trip day. It was a Saturday day, so it was longer than our regular lab times, where we went to multiple sites along the river from upstream to downstream. And this can be adapted to a specific river or how much you want to do that. But the upstream to downstream component was important so that they're marching, sort of flowing with the river downstream, even as you're thinking about sort of timescales and other processes. And they make these observational sketches at each site. And then they take, in small groups, they'll do different surveys, cross-sectional surveys, measurements of a variety of features. And that's some of them at one of the sites in the picture. And then we have to budget post-field trip time in class where they do calculations and comparisons of those measures of the different sites. And then ultimately they collate that data as well as the broader history that we've discussed and been introduced to, and trying to contextualize and tell a story about the longer history of the river. Next slide, please. Ultimately, it took a lot of time, and it's a lot of information to incorporate these different things, the fluvial processes, river connectivity, and the broader human history. It has been suggested to, you know, focus on one or the other. I really, in this case, I come out of geography, but also I've been in really hard science departments where the broader context is just seen as extra or an aside, and I really, really didn't want to relegate it to that. I wanted it to be a component of this lab, not the measures are more important, and some, you know, or I just really didn't want to prioritize one or the other. I wanted it to be a collective story. We always get one or the other, but I wanted it to be together. So the greatest challenge, of course, is time and preparation. in learning that broader history, teaching those methods, especially if it's just one little component of a broader course. So it was difficult, and I don't know how well, like the success is questionable. But I think that I would rather trim little parts of each rather than cut a whole part of it out to make it happen. And so the value really was that the students get a sense of connection to place, both the science component and the measures and that human history, a day in the field, and this really interdisciplinary approach. And if you could just tap it forward, you'll see there's like a little, and I just wanted to say it was 100% worth it, even though it was quite difficult, and I probably didn't succeed in a number of ways. And I'm still working on how to even make little adjustments to it now and how to make it applicable to more people.
Thank you very much.
The smiles tell me that you succeeded. Alan Waxman will now present vegetation survey by drawing. I believe it's our last presentation on lessons.
Thank you very much. My name is Alan Waxman. I'm a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley, hopefully going to graduate soon. This lesson is thinking about how science is a means to negotiate between our socially constructed categories of what exists in the world and our lived experience of what exists in the world. So one way of thinking about that is that different people may group vegetation in different ways. And in this lesson, they create ideographic images in situ to understand locally relevant ecological categories as a group. Participants then collect leaves and develop these symbols together. Then they take a standard topographic plan of the area and assess the locations of the plants that they just categorized as a group. Then those are layered together with topographic maps to understand where the clusters are and where they would become potentially polygons of categorized vegetation. This can be done in any language. The lesson is meant to be seen primarily by pictures. I ran it. You can go to the next slide. Oh, actually, go back to that last slide. You can go back for a second. On the right are some of the images on the lesson itself that try to portray this idea. There's a couple people looking at a landscape, and you don't know the way people cut up that landscape in their mind. The second little picture there is one group of people communicate, and they see maybe a series of polygons for where the vegetation exists. And another group of people sees they cut it up differently in their mind and see different vegetation. So this lesson is a method of going through the process and understanding that and critiquing that as a team. Go to the next slide. A little bit of background information that's not on QUBES that I wanted to share with you is the theoretical inspiration for this. There were a series of Forest Service maps made in the 20th century led by this scholar, Albert Everett Weislander, and that may be him or some member of his team there with an Arctostaphylos plant in California, and at right is one of these maps. They used topographic maps, and they would actually climb to the top of the hill, and then they would map out different vegetation categories. Let's go to the next one. So they were able to map that out according to their own method of what stands for vegetation category. They worked that out in the process of doing it. They came up with different colors to associate with different vegetation. For example, on the right, you see chamise includes things like adenostemma, Arctostaphylos, heteromeles, and ceanothus, and dense chaparral includes a different kind of Arctostaphylos, ceanothus, monkeyflower mimulus, Garrya fremonti, etc. So they came up with the categories. So this is a little bit of background information. Let's go to the next one. I ran the workshop a few times at the University of Michoacan, where I was a guest 3 times with 3 different groups, sometimes undergrad, grad, PhD students, and it was run in Spanish and Purépecha languages. I can't speak any Purépecha, and my Spanish, I think, is lacking. It's okay, but it's lacking. The point was to actually have less good communication by words and better communication through drawing these plants to create these categories as a team. It's all about the physical experience. Here we're in a cemetery, and on the left, some of the students have collected random vegetation, and on the right, they've divided it as a team into these separate categories of vegetation. The next slide. Then they come up with a logo, an idea graph that describes each category, and at the right, they layer that study because they go out in the field and they as a team, each team takes one category, they map it out with dots or circles, and then they layer that together and they create their vegetation map. So the goal of this is to really get students to critique the ideas that science, such as Latin category names, scientific terminology around plants or around potentially any kind of abiotic or biotic element in a river system is set, and critique that, instead see that this is something that is co-created as a team. And in fact, even on the on the national level. And the interesting thing is that these days, as we've leaned further and further into satellite mapping, it's become more and more obfuscated, but there's still just as much socially created category. So my hope is that this can be done more and more, particularly in different languages other than the mainstream languages, perhaps indigenous languages, and we can be doing science such that it creates alternative structures of critique around vegetation, around river systems.
Thank you so much, Alan. I can jump in here, Andy, and just say thank you, scholars, for dialing in a huge amount of work into a very succinct infomercial, as it were, or pitch for your lessons. And I wanted to say to all of those who were watching that these lessons are all available to you. The scholars have created them for you. And if you visit the network's website, there are now 29 lessons that are available, including the 11 new ones that you are just being daylighted for the first time today. And that these lessons have already, going back on the previous classes as well, been viewed thousands and thousands of times. And this is a real gift that the scholars are leaving as they sort of pass the torch and complete their time with us. Congratulations to all the scholars. For those of them who have participated in the 2024 program, presenting, publishing their lesson on QUBES and sharing it with the community of the network here at this winter gathering is their final, thesis defense, as it were. And they can now sort of turn the tassel from, River Scholar aspirant to a River Scholar alumni. So congratulations to all of you, and thank you so much for helping create the scholarship, the network with us. Each cohort transforms the program, in a huge way. And so we're indebted to them not only for the lessons that they've contributed, but also to how they've interacted with us and how they've shaped the community that we're creating together.